Good afternoon. I'm Tom Neer, chair of the Terry Lecture Committee, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Peter Adamson for his third and final Terry Lecture, 2025. Following the lecture, you're all invited to join us for a reception, so just go out here to the lecture hall with the Tiffany stained window. The center says Science and Religion, by the way. Should be kind of our sign here at the Terry Lectureship, because the Terry Lectureship, established at Yale in 1905, represents a unique intersection of science and religion, exploring life's most profound questions about existence, morality, and the human spirit. Peter Adamson, professor of late ancient and Arabic philosophy at Munich's Ludwig Maximilian University, has brought extraordinary depth and accessibility to these complex themes. Through his acclaimed podcast, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, and his distinguished academic career at institutions including King's College London, he has made philosophical discourse both rigorous and engaging. Yesterday, continuing his exploration of global philosophy, Professor Adamson examined religion as a body of practice, offering a fascinating overview of philosophical critiques of ritual and sacrifice. However, beyond his scholarly excellence, what has truly distinguished his time here has been his remarkable engagement with our community. During a recent tea at Sabre College, he demonstrated the rare ability to make complex philosophical concepts accessible while making every student feel valued and heard. In fact, I think he would make an outstanding head of college here at Yale University. So please join me in welcoming Professor Adamson for his concluding Terry Lecture.
Okay, so thank you, Tom, so much for that third gracious introduction. I think you might be now vying for the title of literally my biggest fan, to go by the introductions at least. And I'd just like to thank everybody. So again, Brenna and Julia, who did all the organization for this, the Terry Committee for inviting me in the first place, and for those of you who have come to hear the lectures. Out of curiosity, how many of you have been here now for all three? All right, so you get a prize, and that prize is satisfaction. Okay, let me make sure this works actually. Or maybe it's this one. Yes, okay. So, with this third lecture, I'm going to be moving to look at a very specific skeptical argument. And you're going to see that in this case, unlike yesterday, the themes of religion are not really there from the outset. So it doesn't seem like it has that much to do with religion. But as it goes along, there will be, I hope, a clear relationship between what I'm talking about here and a very familiar problem in philosophy of religion, which is religious pluralism. And what I mean will be clear, hopefully, as I go along. But basically what we're going to be talking about is animals. And the reason I put this one last is that animals are fun. So it means that we have animals on the slides, which is fun, right? And there's stories about animals, which is fun. Thinking about animals is fun. I'm not going to deny this. We're just leaning into philosophizing about animals is fun. Okay? So enjoy. Okay, skepticism across borders, arguments from animal difference in Chinese, Greek, and Arabic philosophy. One of the better known fragments ascribed to Heraclitus states, "Sea is the most pure and the most polluted water. For fishes it is drinkable and salutary, but for men it is undrinkable and deleterious." The point of this is presumably to illustrate the Heraclitean principle that contrary properties may inhere in the same subject. Just as the road up is the road down, one of his more straightforward fragments, so seawater is both potable and poisonous. But the fragment brings to attention a more specific phenomenon, namely the difference between the way animals and humans experience the world. And by the way, I'm just going to be using the word animals to refer to non-human animals, so I don't have to keep saying non-human animals, which would be annoying. Okay, the same theme is at work in other fragments of Heraclitus, such as those which point out that donkeys prefer trash to gold, and that pigs enjoy living in the mud. That's pigs, 2 lectures running. Such observations may give rise to a skeptical musing. Are we wrong to think that gold is precious, given that donkeys turn up their noses at it? Could our preference for not lying in the mud like pigs just be parochial and arbitrary? In general, do we have any grounds for thinking that the human perspective on things is superior to that of animals? One of the earliest philosophical texts to engage deeply with this question is the Daoist classic, the Zhuangzi, named for a sage who lived in the 4th century BC. The Zhuangzi is notable for its frequent use of animals, which play a role in as many as 30 passages. At several points, one is, by the way, the Zhuangzi is the text that famously has the thing about maybe I'm a butterfly, dreaming so Zhuangzi has a dream that he's a butterfly, wakes up and thinks, wait, maybe I'm a butterfly dreaming that I'm a human, right? And that's the butterfly here in the corner. And this kind of already gives you a hint that this is a quite skeptically inclined text. We'll come back over and over to the question of how skeptical it is. At several points, one is forcefully reminded of Heraclitus, as when one character mentions that unlike humans, some animals like to sleep in trees or on damp ground, just like the pigs lying in the mud. Furthermore, humans eat the flesh of hay-fed and grain-fed beasts, deer eat the grass, centipedes relish snakes, owls and crows crave mice. Which of the four has a proper sense of taste? One difference from Heraclitus, though, is that these examples are used to support an explicitly skeptical stance. As the same character has just mused, how do I know that what I call knowing is not ignorance? Which is about as straightforward a statement of skepticism as you could ask for, right? The point of the passage as a whole would seem to be that the perspective of humans is too limited to make definitive judgments about things in the world. There is a clash between the judgments made by humans and those made by animals. Furthermore, the Zhuangzi gives us two reasons to think that this clash cannot be decided. First, disputes are irresolvable because of the impossibility of finding a neutral arbiter. If you and I are having a disagreement, then it would clearly be unfair for one of us to be allowed to judge the issue. And as the Zhuangzi says, if I get someone of a party different from either of us to decide it, being already of a party different from either of us, how can he decide it? Consequently, you and I and he are all unable to know where we stand, and shall we find someone else to depend on? Notice that this is a completely general argument for the undecidability of disputes. When everyone has their own point of view, no one view can ever be decisive. And though it is phrased here in terms of disagreement between humans, the problem would apply also to disagreement between animals and humans. Indeed, it may apply even more straightforwardly in the case of animals, since it is unclear how we could find a third-party judge who is neither human nor animal. Though, spoiler alert, we're going to meet one later. And all this should undermine our confidence in our own position within any dispute. As David Wong has nicely put it, our inability to justify our own perspective over that of others becomes more disturbing and threatening to retaining confidence in that perspective. We presume that at most one perspective can be right about how things are, and yet we are unable to show, not just to others, but also to ourselves, why we are more justified in holding our perspective. So that's one reason why disputes are irresolvable. No neutral arbiter. Second, it may not even be possible for one party even to appreciate the viewpoint of the other party. One may be locked within one's perspective, not merely in the sense of being inevitably biased in favor of it, but in the sense that one cannot even grasp what the other perspective amounts to. This point is explored in what is probably the most famous passage from the Zhuangzi involving animals, and this is a text that's so famous that there are numerous philosophy papers about it. Okay, here it is. And if you're the kind of person who sometimes zones out during philosophy talks, stop zoning out now, because for two reasons. One, this is awesome, and two, I'm going to keep coming back to this. Okay, this is a very key text, but mostly just it's awesome. Okay, Zhuangzi and Huizi were strolling on the bridge above the Hao River. Out swim the minnows, so free and easy, said Zhuangzi. That's how fish are happy. Huizi says, you aren't a fish. How do you know that the fish are happy? Zhuangzi says, you aren't me, so how do you know that I don't know the fish are happy? Huizi says, we'll grant that not being you, I don't know about you, but you'll grant that you're not a fish. And that completes the case that you don't know the fish are happy. Zhuangzi says, let's go back to where we started. When you said, how do you know that the fish are happy? You asked me the question already knowing that I knew. I knew it from up here above the How River. Cool, right? Okay, there's a lot going on here. We're going to have to unpack it. Let me first just explain who these two guys are. So Zhuangzi is the lead character in the text, so it's named after him, just like we saw with the Xunzi, for example, yesterday. These texts are often named after the main sage or philosopher in the text. And he usually gets the better of whoever he's talking to. It's an interesting question whether he gets the better of Huizi here or not, right? Who's Huizi? Huizi is often thought of as a kind of sophist, a juggler with words and arguments, who was notorious for that in general, and often he appears here in the Zhuangzi as his kind of straight man being defeated in argument. On the other hand, they're also represented as being good friends, and there's a passage where Zhuangzi, after Huizi's death, says, "Now who will I find to discuss with?" Okay, so they're sort of the Laurel and Hardy of Taoism. Okay, as has been pointed out in several studies, the exchange seems to turn on a perspectivist principle assumed by Huizi along the following lines. In order to know about the experiences of X, one must be X oneself. That's as far as I'm going to go in formalization, you'll be glad to know. Huizi's initial move is to apply this at the level of species. Since Zhuangzi is not a fish, so that's being put in for X, he cannot know the experiences of fish. Zhuangzi turns the tables by applying the same principle at the level of individuals. Since Huizi is not Zhuangzi, putting Zhuangzi in for X, he cannot know the experiences of Zhuangzi. With this counter-move, Zhuangzi has transposed a skeptical argument from the animal-human boundary to the human-human boundary. An obvious way of blocking the counter-move, therefore, would have been for Huizi to say that the principle operates only at the species level and not at the individual level. Hence his reply. Although he admittedly cannot know Zhuangzi's experiences, the perspectivist principle still shows that the minnow's experiences are unknowable for Zhuangzi or any other human. That does not bring the dialogue to an end. Huizi, as a kind of sophist, is bested by a counter-thrust, so showing the flaw in his reasoning, right? But the counter-thrust isn't sort of to reveal a logical failure. It seems almost like he's changing the subject. So he says, I knew it from so let me go back so you can read it again. He says, you asked me the question already knowing that I knew it from up above the how, which doesn't look like he's critiquing the principle, or it doesn't look relevant even, right? So this has been interpreted in various ways, and I'm going to come back at the end of the talk to what might be going on here. For now, though, I'd like to take stock and underline the contrast between the two sorts of skeptical consideration we've been offered by this ancient Daoist text, both of which are applicable to our problem of animal difference. First, we have a problem which I would call the problem of undecidability. If animals perceive things one way and humans another, there's no way to determine which perception is true, if either. Second, we have a problem of unknowability. Animal experience is not something to which humans have access. We just don't know what it's like to be a minnow. These problems could be combined into a two-stage skeptical problem as follows. Since we are humans, we cannot know how humans are perceiving the world. That's stage one. But even if we could know, we still couldn't decide between their perceptions and our own. This sort of strategy to lay down a skeptical objection to dogmatic knowledge claims and then add a further objection in case the first objection is somehow overcome is familiar from the history of skepticism in other cultures, not least in the work of the great 2nd century CE Pyrrhonist Sextus Empiricus. And it is to him that I'd like to turn shortly. First, though, I want to admit to a sleight of hand that I performed in stating the skeptical challenge just now. With the problem of undecidability, we are clearly dealing with what we might call propositional truth claims. The donkey, for example, thinks that gold is worthless. The human thinks that gold is valuable, right? So they're disagreeing about a sentence, as it were. So they disagree whether or not gold is worthless. With the problem of unknowability, by contrast, we're talking about something like experience. Obviously, a lot of philosophical work would be needed to spell out rigorously what that might mean, but it seems that different experiences need not be mutually contradictory. If I feel sick to my stomach and you feel healthy, then we're not disagreeing. I deliberately glossed over this distinction by using the ambiguous word perceiving. This can mean grasping a certain thing as being a certain way, in which case the perception would have propositional content. For example, the donkey grasping gold as worthless. But it can also just mean having an experience, like your stomach hurting. In this second sense, I might say that I do not perceive the world a fish does, and admit that I cannot even imagine what it is like to be a fish, without suggesting that there's any point of dispute between me and the fish. Here, it may be instructive to glance briefly at a much more recent text that the philosophers in the room have already been thinking about. The famous paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, by Thomas Nagel. That's the bat, not Nagel. By the way, cute bat, right? They get such a bad rep, but adorable bat. Nagel says explicitly in this paper that he's talking about the subjective character of experience. The gist of his paper is to claim that this subjective character cannot be captured by means of what he calls an objective physical theory. Now, obviously, Nagel has, as it were, other fish to fry than Zhuangzi did. Get it? This is a good teaching trick. If the first joke doesn't land, make a joke about the fact that the joke didn't land, and you'll usually get a laugh for that. I've been doing that for years. Still, there's a parallel between his considerations and what we find in the passage about the minnows. He wants us to see that the subjective experiences of the bat are inaccessible to humans, much as Zhuangzi said that the experiences of the fish are unknowable to humans. Actually, Nagel goes even further than Zhuangzi, remarking in a footnote, "My point is not that we cannot know what it is like to be a bat. I'm not raising that epistemological problem. My point is rather that even to form a conception of what it is like to be a bat, and a fortiori to know what it is like to be a bat, one must take up the bat's point of view." Also, like Zhuangzi in the dialogue, Nagel transposes his argument from the animal-human case to a human-human case, when he wonders whether a sighted and hearing person could know what it is like to be deaf and blind from birth, or vice versa. So there is a kind of skepticism in Nagel's piece, a variant of the unknowability problem that he raises to the level of an inconceivability problem. But it would be quite beside the point to continue his argument by raising the undecidability problem, as I did in the two-stage skeptical challenge. Disagreements, whether across species or between individuals, are simply not at issue for Nagel. He does also speak about facts having to do with the subjective experience. For instance, as he puts it, facts about what it is like to be a bat which embody a particular point of view. And this might seem to introduce items with propositional content into the discussion. Yet Nagel explicitly says that these facts do not consist in the truth of propositions expressible in a human language. He goes so far as to say that humans would not be able to state or comprehend them. In any case, despite his invocation of facts, Nagel's argument does nothing to suggest that there is a disagreement between bats and humans about whether it is pleasant to eat bugs or be upside down. By contrast, it's exactly this sort of disagreement that interested Sextus Empiricus. It's already been pointed out more than once that there seems to be a parallel between some of the skeptical moves made in the Zhuangzi and what we find in Sextus's outlines of Pyrrhonism. But previous studies have not emphasized the use of animals in both texts, as I would like to do here. Like the Zhuangzi, Sextus highlights the skeptical consequences that can be drawn from the differences between animal and human experience. As it happens, he also alludes to the fragments in Heraclitus mentioned at the start of the lecture. This in the course of developing the first of 10 skeptical modes, drawn likely with significant modification from the earlier skeptic Anisodemus. In the Zhuangzi, we saw a skeptical argument being implied first at the level of cross-species difference, so Zhuangzi and the fish, and then at the level of individuals within a species, Zhuangzi and Zhuangzi. It's striking that the same thing happens here in the skeptical modes. His first mode argues from the difference between animals, and then the second from disagreements between humans. Modes 3 and 4 take the next logical step by finding disagreements even within an individual, since the senses of just one person may clash with another, that's the third mode, or a person may have different impressions in different circumstances. That's the fourth mode. Taken together, these four modes form a subgroup among the list of 10. These four opening modes have in common that they argue from the subject of judgment. So it's animal-human, human-human, sense-power, and circumstance-circumstance. Sextus also mentions that this structure exemplifies the fallback strategy I mentioned earlier. So the idea is that even if you could establish that human judgments are more reliable than animal ones, the skeptic could then retrench to disagreements between humans. And then they could retrench again to differences between the sense impressions of a single human. Right? They've always got another fallback strategy. This is why skeptics are so annoying. The argument of the first mode has been well summarized by Gisela Stryker. So here's how she sort of formalizes it. The same things produce different impressions in different kinds of animals. That's the first premise. Second premise, it's impossible to decide which impressions are correct. Hence, third premise, we can say how the underlying thing appears to us, but we will suspend judgment as to how it is with regard to nature. And in fact, the whole section on the first mode in Sextus falls into two parts, which in my view are devoted respectively to arguing for the first and second premise. I will divide my own discussion accordingly and suggest that there is in fact a tension between Sextus's defense of premise 1 and his defense of premise 2. In favor of the first premise, Sextus argues at length that animals must have different impressions, the word for impression in Greek is phantasia, because of the way that animals are generated and because of the makeup of their bodies. On the latter point, Sextus works systematically through the sense modalities, suggesting, for instance, that having different eyes and flesh, animals must see and feel things differently than we do. And he even mentions that fish have hard eyes, so they must see things differently. Tom, I hope you're enjoying all the fish.
Very much.
Yeah. You can actually, when I leave, you can actually say goodbye and thanks for all the fish. That just occurred to me. Right? Okay. Okay, so he wraps up his defense of the first premise by saying that the animal's very first different preferences prove that they must be having different impressions. And this is why he quotes Heraclitus' seawater drinking fish and mud wallowing pigs. In another parallel to the Zhuangzi, Sextus also refers here to the diversity of animal diets, so what they like to eat. A noteworthy feature of Sextus's defense of the first premise is that it exploits the same ambiguity I used above, between different types of experience and different truth claims about what is being experienced. Just as I sneakily papered over this distinction by talking of perception, Sextus employs the ambiguous word phantasia. On the one hand, this term evokes the subjective experience enjoyed by an animal. Many of Sextus's examples seem to allude to this dimension. For example, he suggests that much as we smell things differently when we have a cold, so an animal whose constitution is dominated by phlegm, which is one of the four humors, right, would have a different olfactory experiences than we do. So like a moist animal would smell like it always had a cold. That's his idea. And here Sextus uses the verb phanesthai when he draws the conclusion, given this difference, it is reasonable to suppose that the things they smell should appear different to each of them. And that's experience, that's not propositional, it's just how something smells, right? On the other hand, the same verb phanesthai can take a propositional complement and be translated, it seems that, ... So we could say, it seems to the goat or the donkey that gold is worthless. A passage at the end of the whole section strikes a fine balance between the two ideas. He says, if the same things are unpleasant to some animals and pleasant to others, and if the pleasant and unpleasant lie in appearances, then appearances produced in animals from existing objects are different. While I would not like to accuse Sextus of outright equivocation here, not that he would be above that, it seems to me that his argument does at least gain in plausibility thanks to the semantic flexibility of phantasia and phanesthai. Animals experience things differently, so it seems to them that a given thing is pleasant or unpleasant, assessments with which humans may disagree. And these, I think, are significantly different claims which are being run together. The first claim about experience would be consistent with Nagel's view and with the problem of unknowability. I simply have no idea how things look to a creature with eyes like those of a fish. For Sextus, though, there needs to be such disagreement, this being the whole point of the skeptical modes. The whole idea is to get us to suspend judgment between two parties to a dispute. So there has to be a dispute. Without a propositional content, there's no dispute, right? So to get this, he needs to exploit the propositional connotation of phainasthai, which evokes the problem of undecidability. Since the fish experiences seawater as potable and I experience it as poisonous, there is a disagreement between us as to whether seawater is potable or poisonous. I would add that the first claim about different forms of experience looks a good deal less contentious than the second claim about disagreements. For the latter claim to stand, we need animals to be making at least tacit judgments about the things they perceive. For instance, judging them to be unpleasant or pleasant in order that humans can disagree with those judgments. But it is, at the very least, not obvious that animals are able to do this. And in fact, other philosophical schools in antiquity would have disagreed because they would say animals can't form judgments, they can't use language, right? So the donkey's not judging that gold is worthless. The donkey's just not trotting towards the gold because it has no instinct for doing so. So the slide from different experiences to different judgments considerably weakens his argument. Sextus is, of course, the last philosopher who should mind being subjected to a battery of objections. So he would surely not take it amiss if I note a further problem with his exposition of the first mode. This arises when he turns to defend premise 2, namely that one cannot resolve the question whether animal or human appearances are correct. In a nutshell, my worry here is that his defense of this premise tends to undermine his defense of premise 1 and vice versa. His initial move regarding premise 2 will be familiar to us from the Zhuangzi. He says, "We shall not be able ourselves to decide between our own appearances and those of our other animals, being ourselves a part of the dispute, and for that reason more in need of someone to decide than ourselves able to judge." Another all-purpose consideration is then added, to the effect that some proof would be needed to resolve the dispute between animals and humans, which will, for various reasons, not be forthcoming. Only then does Sextus return to considerations proper to the topic of animals, and in particular the lowliest of animals, namely the dog. He provides a battery of arguments to show that this animal chooses what is appropriate and avoids what is disturbing, has an expertise or craft, techne, which provides what is appropriate and is not outside the scope of virtue. This encomium to the perfect canine is offered in part for the sake of ridiculing the dogmatists, I guess pun intended. Though there are, actually I'm not sure that was intended, but it was me, so it probably pun intended. This encomium is offered in part for the sake of ridiculing the dogmatists, though there are obvious and less obvious points of reference that may have inspired the choice, from Odysseus' dog in Homer to the philosophical dogs in Plato's Republic, and as Sextus himself points out, the Cynics. There's actually an article in German from 1975, which is devoted exclusively to explaining why Sextus might have chosen the dog as the example animal here. Germans. Gotta love them. But Sextus does also state that the argument could have been used with any species. For example, birds, he says, have sagacity, ankynoia, and even the ability to make use of uttered language. In general, given the remarkably human-like abilities found in many animal species, we must conclude that animals are at no disadvantage to us when it comes to the reliability of their appearances. Now, here's the reason I see a tension between Sextus's defense of premises 1 and 2. In his treatment of premise 1, he needed to emphasize the enormous dissimilarity between humans and animals. If animals were to see, smell, and prefer the same things we do, then there would be no disagreement across species. But in support of premise 2, Sextus needs to argue for the similarity of humans and animals, which he does by ascribing to animals capacities and features shared by humans. Indeed, they are said to have capacities and features possessed by the better sort of humans, like expertise, virtue, and sagacity. Now, this is certainly not an outright contradiction, but it points towards an irony at the heart of the argument from animal difference. The more one credits animals with the sort of advanced cognitive faculties often thought to be unique to humans, the less reason one will have to suspect that they genuinely have a different experience or perspective on the world. After all, if animals have more or less the same capacities for perception, memory, imagination, thought, and even language as humans, then they do not add much to the diversity among subjects on which the first 4 of the Aenesidemon modes crucially depend. So the thought here is that he first tries to get you to think, oh, animals must be really different from us, so they must be having very different kinds of perceptions. And then he says, but who are we to criticize animals? After all, they're just like smart humans. right? Doesn't make sense. To appreciate the difficulty more fully, let's take another leap in time and place and consider a skeptically inclined philosopher who goes on at great length about animals, the 16th century French philosopher, or at least thinker, Michel de Montaigne. In what is probably the most celebrated of his essays, Montaigne defends a work of scholastic theology he had earlier translated at his own father's behest, the Book of Creatures by Raymond Sebond. Responding to critics who found the arguments of Sebond unpersuasive, Montaigne adopts the bold tactic of saying that this is hardly surprising since humans cannot expect to provide truly convincing arguments on any topic, especially theology. Human reason, he says, goes astray everywhere, but especially when she concerns herself with matters divine. Warming to his theme, he offers a lengthy disquisition about animals, which is intended to cure the natural original distemper of humankind, namely presumption. The ponderings that issued in Montaigne's essays did much to cure him of this distemper. He had admitted elsewhere, "There's virtually nothing that I know," and in the essay on Sebond, he declares it a plague upon humankind that people have the opinion that they know something. The same tension we saw in Sextus is on display in Montaigne's skeptical discussion of animals, but here it's much more striking, thanks to Montaigne's charming and self-admitted tendency to go on at length with a profusion of animals and digressions. He thematizes the unknowability of animal experiences, not least with the classic line, "When I play with my cat, how do I know that she's not passing time with me rather than I with her?" But that's probably my favorite line in Montaigne, against a lot of competition, actually. But the great bulk of his evidence is intended to show that animals are on a par with humans. In fact, he says outright, we ought to note the parity there is between humans and animals. We have some modest understanding of what so for example, they refers back to things like the barking of dogs, what they mean, and they have the same of us in about equal measure. And after a few more pages of the astounding abilities of animals, he says, I've gone into all this to emphasize similarities with things human, so bringing humankind into conformity with the majority of creatures. We are neither above them nor below them. At the risk of belaboring the point, because if Montaigne can do it, why can't I? He still later defines the topic of this whole section as equalities and correspondences between us and the beasts. In our other texts, we've seen shifts from disagreements between animals and humans to disagreement between humans and humans. The same thing happens in Montaigne, but characteristically in such a way as to defeat our expectations. He says, there is a greater difference between one human and another than between some humans and some beasts. This fits with a favorite theme of Montaigne, the inconstancy and variability of human judgments, including those made by one and the same human at different times, especially those made by Montaigne himself. But by supporting at such length the equality of animal and human judgments as would be needed for Sextus's second premise, Montaigne puts in question his first premise, namely the fundamental difference between animal and human perspectives or appearances. One might say that for the argument of Sextus's first mode to work, we need to hold in balance the idea that animals are foreign to us, which comes out so strongly in the Zhuangzi, and the idea that animals make judgments like those of humans, which is so emphasized by Montaigne. But this is all to make an unspoken assumption, namely that we establish the legitimacy or parity of animal judgments by showing how much they are like human judgments. For all his claims to avoid speciesism or human chauvinism, Montaigne does seem to be making that assumption, as Sextus did before him. That is to say, they seek to support the legitimacy of animal impressions or animal judgments by drawing attention to commonalities between humans and animals. The beasts, too, make plans, solve problems, do logic, use language, and so on. But if the aim is to motivate a skeptical argument on the basis of animal judgments, it must be shown that they are on a par with, yet fundamentally unlike human judgments. So I think a better strategy for the skeptic, a better strategy than the one used by Montaigne or Sextus, would be to abandon all anthropocentric assumptions and to marvel at the wondrous yet alien modes of experience, cognition, and perception found in animals. This, I would argue, is something we can find in an extraordinary text from the Islamic world, produced by the mysterious figures who called themselves Ikhwan as-Safa, meaning brethren of purity. Probably active in the 10th century, they were a collective of anonymous philosophers who covered all areas of philosophy and the religious sciences in an extensive collection of epistles. Of these, the most famous is an epistle that falls into two unequal parts. The first part offers a more or less traditional discussion of animal nature. It seems they are simply trying to include zoology within their curriculum of philosophical treatises in imitation of the zoological works that formed part of the corpus of Aristotle in Arabic translation. Actually, that's kind of an interesting story. If you want, you can ask me about this later. So Aristotle's zoological treatises were translated into Arabic and put together as a single book called Kitab al-Hayawan, which just means Book of Animals. And in general, they get a lot more kind of attention than they do in Greek. So it's not until the Circle of Anakomnene in Byzantium that they got around to commenting on Aristotle's works on animals. Okay, so first you just get a kind of standard presentation of some basics of Aristotelian zoology. But then the Ikhwan change tack. They devote the rest of the epistle, its much greater part, to a narrative in which the animals of the world appeal to the king of the jinn. They hope the king will free them from the oppression they suffer at the hands of humans. What follows is a kind of court case with numerous rhetorical speeches made by representatives of various animal species and also by human spokesmen. So, for example, like the predators nominate the lion to speak on behalf of them to talk about how fantastic predators are. It often reads like a parody of or ironic commentary on legal proceedings concerning human slavery, since the animals repeatedly accuse the humans of wrongfully enslaving them. The speeches made by the animals return again and again to the idea that animals are equal to humans, despite being wholly different from them. They appeal to God's providential care in dispensing to every animal species what it needs to flourish in its own way. No creature, they say, is granted so many virtues and gifts as not to lack something greater, and none is deprived of at least one gift that was granted only to them. And again, they say, when the Creator formed the animals with all their diverse forms and varied shapes, he gave them their ranks and stations. There is equity between them in the giving of generous gifts, the organs and implements by which all might obtain benefits and protect themselves from harms. So all were sufficed by what they were gifted. What the human spokesmen take to be signs of superiority in their own kind are deemed irrelevant by the animals. For instance, they say, it is not better to be upright if your diet consists of grass. The camel's long neck may look ridiculous to humans, but is appropriate given its long legs. Rather than depicting sounds made by animals as rudimentary versions of human language, remember yesterday, or no, was it yesterday? It was the first lecture. We had Saadia saying, what would be a demonstrative syllogism? Well, it would be a noise. But it would have to be a meaningful noise, not like animal noises, right? So forget the animal noises. And the animals in the Ikhwan say, hold on a second, how do you know we're not saying something, right? But it's saying something you could never understand. Right. In fact, the Ikhwan describe birdsong and other animal calls as eloquent praise and honor of the Creator. If only humans could understand these noises, they would realize that among these animal throngs are orators and eloquent speakers, theologians, preachers, admonishers, and diviners, just as there are among the sons of Adam. Even where it may look as if animals are being credited with human-like capacities like thought or wisdom, the animals insist that they have knowledge and understanding that is more fine, subtle, astute, and perfect than that of humans, just as the sense perception of animals is often keener. In short, the animals are allowed by the Ikhwan to praise themselves without ever comparing themselves to humans, or even claiming similarity to them. To the contrary, they are scathing about humans and their sinful, foolish ways. The one non-human creature that comes in for real criticism is, ironically enough, the dog, which is disdained by the other animals for having chosen to live among humans, a sure sign of low character. Now, the Ikhwan are surely in part aiming to use the narrative to issue an ethical critique of humans. In this sense, the epistle falls into an age-old tradition of chastising readers by telling them that if they do not improve their ways, then they will be like animals or even worse than animals. But there's also a more subtle skeptical undercurrent in the epistle as a whole. The speeches given by the animals make use of the equally age-old skeptical tactic of pointing to unresolved disagreements among human religious believers and philosophers. They even evoke the problem of undecidability in terms similar to what we saw in Sextus and the Zhuangzi. After observing that, whenever philosophers meet to inquire into some subject, each sees only one side of the issue and not what has come into the minds of the others, the Ikhwan go on to say that evidence by those who are partisan in the debate should be inadmissible. So, if one effect of the epistle is to make human readers aware of their own moral shortcomings, and another is to encourage them to treat animals with benevolence, then a third is to discourage claims of supremacy over animals based merely on species membership. In the end, the trial does rather abruptly find in favor of the humans, although there's some complications here because there's different recensions of the work, and the ending is different in the different versions. But let's leave that aside. However it ends, I think we're left with the powerful sense that God has assigned to each kind of animal a different but equal place within creation. In fact, diversity itself is taken to be valuable, and by both sides of the debate. At one point, a human spokesman says, "Our great numbers and diverse conditions, our various ways of life, and our marvelous purposes show that we are superior, the noblest creatures on earth, better than all animals put together." But he's then refuted by the frog, who says that among water creatures alone, there's immensely more variation than we can find in humans. This is true across species and even within species. In a further allusion to the value of diversity, the final human speaker who clinches the victory for humankind is described as having Persian breeding, Arabian faith, Iraqi culture, Greek science, and so on. God's gifts are spread across many communities, human and non-human. The best human would be, therefore, one who partakes of the several advantages of all these communities, and I'll return to this point at the end of the lecture today. Analogously, we should appreciate the myriad virtues of the many different animal species, even if, or rather precisely because, we could never hope to possess all of these virtues ourselves. It seems to me that this attitude, or something like it, would undergird the most powerful version of the skeptical argument from animal difference. First, one should argue that animals are very unlike humans, perhaps even to the extent that they and their ways of experiencing the world are unknowable to us. In the Epistle of the Ikhwan, the animal calls that humans fail to understand nicely symbolize this. But the otherness of animal perspectives, their inhumanity, as it were, does not make those perspectives less worthy of respect. To the contrary, diversity of perspectives is itself to be celebrated. The Ikhwan see diversity as a sign of God's bounty, and praise it on this basis, but other rationales could be devised to celebrate diversity. As we've seen, a further premise is still needed, that from within their own perspectives, animals are in some sense making judgments that we do not make. Otherwise, there will be no disagreement, undecidable or otherwise, only diverse kinds of experience which would not necessarily clash. So you need enough similarity between animals and humans to at least get premise C, right? The upshot then will be that animals are making very different judgments than the ones we make, perhaps even judgments we cannot know about or even imagine. And unless we manage to find the king of the jinn and ask him to settle the matter, he would be the neutral arbiter, I promised you, between animals and humans. There will be no third party to whom we can appeal to reassure ourselves that the human judgments are the reliable ones. So the skeptic seems to have prevailed. And to return to the central theme of this week's lectures, I think that many pre-modern philosophers would indeed have some difficulty responding to the skeptical challenge, especially insofar as they denied significant overlap between the cognitions of humans and those of animals. So it would be interesting to think about how someone like Aristotle would respond to this challenge, for example. But as we've seen in the last couple of days, various pre-modern religious traditions may offer resources for responding to skeptics. So, let's, as promised, return to the conclusion of the exchange between Zhuangzi and Huizi. Let me quote it again. Zhuangzi says, "Let's go back to where we started. When you said, 'How do you know that the fish are happy?' you asked me the question already knowing that I knew it from up above the how." There have been a variety of attempts to explain this final move. Many commentators note that there's a wordplay, or more pejoratively, an equivocation involving the word an, which can mean either how or from where, like whence. It looks as if Zhuangzi is willfully misunderstanding Huizi's question by replying from up here above the river. So he's taking the sentence, "How do you know?" and he's interpreting it to mean, "Whence did I know?" Right? Because in Chinese that works, right? And I have to say, I mean, I don't know Chinese, but from reading about the Zhuangzi, there is a lot of wordplay going on in the Zhuangzi. So if you read secondary literature about it, it almost always refers to some kind of wordplay or punning. But There's presumably a deeper purpose here, which is to draw our attention toward the perspective from whence, Zhuangzi has made his judgment about the happiness of the fish. In particular, he has done this from a vantage point which Huizi shares. Both men are on the bridge looking down at the river. So perhaps Zhuangzi is inviting Huizi to see whether he doesn't, as Sextus might put it, have the same impression Zhuangzi is having. This goes well with the rather cryptic remark, "You asked me the question already knowing that I knew." Huizi was only pretending not to be able to appreciate Zhuangzi's point of view, from which the fish do indeed look happy. So if Zhuangzi is willfully pretending not to understand the word an as whence, he's only repaying Huizi in kind. Effectively, he's saying, well, don't they look happy to you? Right? They probably do. They look happy to me. We're standing in the same place. As Mike Beeney has argued, this invitation to share a point of view is a way of casting doubt on Huizi's perspective principle. So I've said before, it does look like he's not even responding to the principle, but maybe he is, implicitly. Because his remark makes us realize that at least partial overlap is, after all, possible between two subjects. So as another reminder, the principle would be something like, in order to know about the experiences of X, one must be X oneself. Given that they are both humans engaged in the same activity, strolling above a river, looking down at fish, the sages are bound to have a good deal of overlap between their experiences. Effectively, Zhuangzi does what Huizi might have done earlier in the exchange, by implying that the principle is false when applied to differences between humans. Or at least it's a gross exaggeration, since it rules out any commonality of perspective. As another commentator has remarked, for Huizi to deny all possibility of knowing how Zhuangzi sees the world is to adopt an unrealistic standard of knowing. So much for the skeptical move as applied to human-human cases. What about human-animal cases? Here I would take an insight from another recent paper on the passage by Leah Cantor. Again, here wordplay is involved. The same term, yu, is used to describe both the meandering of the men as they stroll and the meandering of the fish in the river. This is unlikely to be coincidental. The question is, what does it mean? A strong possibility is that we are meant to see another chance to cross a boundary between perspectives. The experience of fish is no doubt further from that of Zhuangzi than Zhuangzi's experience is from that of Huizi. But why suppose that they have nothing in common at all? If we're happy meandering up here above the river, why not think that the fish are also happy meandering down there in the river? This Daoist response encourages us to strive for something like empathy with animals, to think about how our experiences and theirs might not be in disagreement after all, even if they are very different. Actually, the Zhuangzi goes further still by imagining the perspective of a sacred tree, which is glad to be made of what seems to be a human carpenter to be useless wood, because this means it will never be cut down. What could be more useful than that? This is a wonderful passage where a carpenter has a dream. While he's awake, he says, "Oh, this tree, totally useless. Look at the twisted wood." And then he has a dream where the tree says to him, "I'm really glad to be made of twisted wood, because otherwise people like you would cut me down and turn me into tables." And I think you don't need to be a Taoist to find this plausible. Montaigne, whose constantly shifting opinions had a good deal to do with his talent for seeing things from different points of view, at one point writes, "There is a certain respect and general duty of humanity that attaches us not only to animals, who have life and feeling, but even to trees and plants." He's the Zhuangzi of the late Reformation period. "We owe justice to men and mercy and kindness to other creatures that may be capable of receiving it. There is some relationship between them and us and some mutual obligation. I am not afraid to admit that my nature is so childishly affectionate that I cannot easily refuse an untimely gambol to my dog whenever it begs one." Some might view Montaigne's helpless empathy with, skepticism. Perhaps we cannot really know what it is like to be a dog, a fish, or a bat. Nagel chose the latter example because of the sheer otherness of bats, creatures with wings that navigate using sonar. On these grounds, he rules out the possibility of extrapolating the inner life of the bat from his own case. Zhuangzi would presumably tell Nagel that his inability to do so is a failure of philosophical imagination, a narrowness of perspective that is typical of non-Taoists. I'd be reluctant to describe classical Taoism as religious as opposed to philosophical. This is back to Paul's question from the first lecture. religion and philosophy, but or even religion and whether it's all religion, everything we're talking about. But one might at least say that the Zhuangzi's idea of a perspective so broad that it incorporates all perspectives is one shared with other global other global religious traditions. It's an idea vividly captured at the start of the work, as it happens, with a description of another animal, the enormous peng bird, whose wings are like clouds hanging from the sky and which reaches such a height that everything below looks the same as above. Two much smaller creatures, a cicada and a turtle dove, mock the peng bird, prompting the narrator to comment, "What do these two creatures know? Little wits cannot keep up with great or few years with many." The peng bird's exalted perspective and the more general tendency of the Zhuangzi to critique limited standpoints reminds me forcefully of the epistemology of the Jains, which we looked at in the first lecture. There's at least a loose parallel between the Daoist and Jain positions, both of which critique rival schools for their adherence to narrow, or as the Jains put it, one-sided perspectives on the world. Lest we leap to the assumption that this is one of those cliched differences between so-called Eastern and Western philosophy, the Easterners are multi-perspectival, the Westerners are dogmatic or something like that, I'd like you to cast your mind back to the final human spokesman we saw in the epistle by the Ikhwan. As I said, he's an embodiment of the diversity of humankind, combining in one person the best features of all the cultures of the world, or at least all the cultures the Ikhwan knew about and cared to name. These include the Indians, whose talent for discernment is exhibited by the spokesman. This valuing of diversity is, I think, one important underlying message of the epistle as a whole, and it's one with a clearly religious motivation. Because all humans, indeed all animals, are created by a wise and benevolent God, all creatures great and small have a legitimate perspective on the world. And we might add, all religions have a legitimate perspective on the world. So that would be the relevance to this issue of religious pluralism. The greatest perspective of them all would be the one that includes all of the more specific perspectives. In Taoism, that would be the achievement of the sage. In Jainism, of the Ford makers like Mahavira. But for the Ikhwan, I suppose that it is a standpoint occupied only by God himself. Thanks very much for your attention.
If you have questions or comments, please come up to either of the microphones here at the aisle.
Great, thank you so much. I had a question about, in some of your framings of the first two examples that you gave a kind of argument against the form of skepticism, or at least a tension that the skeptic would have to deal with, which is, in these cases of animal difference, they have to both argue that animal judgments are similar to human judgments in some respect, and different enough to human judgments to produce skepticism.
Exactly.
And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, because it seems like they could be similar in one respect and different in another respect.
Yeah.
So you were making a distinction between perceiving something versus perceiving that something is the case.
Yeah.
So they could be similar in that their perceptions are propositional. They're seeing that something is the case, but they're different in that they're perceiving the content is different. They're
Exactly.
that something is different.
Right.
So does the last example you give, I think you seem to hint at that somehow resolved this problem or explained the similarity and the difference?
Exactly.
Could you explain that
how that works? Yeah. Thanks. That's a great question. So that's supposed to. So the idea was to get a version of the skeptical argument where that could work, right? And so the thought was that to get C, what we want to do is get C. They are making judgments so that we can disagree with them, right? We need that to be the case if we're running the skeptical argument. But we also want to hold on to A and B, right? So what I was saying is that Sextus and Montaigne have A and C, but in order to get B, so, or their version of B, would be to say, well, why is the animal perspective not less worthy of respect? Well, because they're like little humans, right? They have crafts, they have wisdom, they have virtue, and it sounds very much like when Sextus is talking about the dog, it sounds very much like the dog is a particularly outstanding little human with 4 legs, right? And so what I was saying is that, because remember, it's not enough for them to have disagreeing opinions with us. We need to be able to say, to avoid allowing the dogmatist to respond, well, I don't particularly care what animals think. They're animals, dude. Right? Why should we take what they think seriously? And I think when they respond to that when they sort of anticipate that counter move and respond to it, Montaigne and Sextus undermine A, right? Right? They are knowable to us, right? We know just what's going on in there. Like, they're just like the best guy you know, right? They're like little philosophers or whatever. And they do that so that they can get C, right? But I think that the Ikhwan is better because they run this argument without extolling animals by comparing them to humans. That's really what I was trying to think. So that's kind of complicated, but does that make sense?
Yeah.
Better? Okay, great, thanks. Thank you for asking that question so I could sort of clarify that. Okay, yes, Henry.
Yeah, thank you for that again. I had a question.
About teleology.
Oh, sadly, no. Maybe you can say about teleology anyway in response to it. Maybe there is some teleology in there. So it's about possibly different kinds of skepticism in different religions playing different roles. The kind of the kind of skepticism you introduced in the first lecture, the sort of skepticism as we kind of associate with modern scientists, right? It's not a kind of, it's a skepticism associated with kind of humility, skepticism associated with provisionality, and skepticism itself kind of it's sort of pushing you just to kind of gather more evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Conduct rational argumentation, theorize better. While in kind of, in the Zhuangzi, we get suggested that skepticism might be more like something for its own sake, or you're employing skepticism so you get to something else.
Right.
That is, you get this kind of this higher state that you get via skepticism.
Uh-huh.
I don't think it might get a little bit too comparative, but I wonder if that's kind of similar to the kind of role we find of skepticism in the kind of apophatic Christian tradition, right? The kind of pseudo-Dionysius, Nicholas de Cusa, where the way of our knowing is itself not aimed at getting towards a higher state of rational knowledge, it's aimed you unknow for the sake of getting sort of acquaintance with God.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that, but also if you think there are kind of perhaps different skepticisms we're seeing throughout the free lecture, and the skepticisms might be kind of performing different roles.
Yeah, right. Okay. So you're kind of asking me to improvise the introduction to the book, which is great. So that's, of course, I've been thinking about that a lot while I prepared the lectures, and I mean, I think that maybe there's a little bit of a tension in the whole project because it's sort of pulled between trying to give this one overall picture and then do justice to these very specific cases that I'm talking about. And you might even be right that I'm in danger of equivocating on skepticism, right? But I think, let me sort of go back to the first part of what you said. So when you said, well, modern science has this kind of commitment to provisionality, we need to consider more evidence and so on. I wanted to say something a little bit stronger than that, which is that at least sometimes people, when they think about modern scientists, are open to the idea that we'll never be done. So it's open-ended, right? Whether, in fact, scientists think like this is, of course, a very big question. And probably if you ask them, like, is gravity, the theory of gravity, provisional, they would say, no, that's just true, right? Most of them. But philosophers of science tend to think, no, it's all provisional, it's all maybe instrumental, something like that. So that idea of the in-principle uncertainty of what we call scientific knowledge is something that would be anathema to someone like, let's say, Aristotle, or even to go to other traditions like Nyaya epistemology, right? So we have a lot of very confident, to use a word we were using in the Q&A yesterday, we have a lot of very confident philosophers in these pre-modern traditions. So my thought is that the religious thinkers are saying, partially to make room for this higher sort of perspective or cognition, which might be one that cannot be had by humans, right? That's, I think, a difference between the different traditions. So Mahavira is a human, a Daoist sage is a human. The Abrahamic traditions tend to think it's only God who has this kind of perspective, but it's always sort of religiously connotated, this higher perspective, which goes beyond provisionality, beyond any kind of skeptical challenge, beyond one-sidedness, right? It's, in order to make room for that, they say, well, you rationalists don't get as far as you think, right? So I think that's what these kind of skepticism have in common. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for speaking. So at the very end of your talk, you mentioned that if there is like a good God that's created all these different species, then therefore like they're all good, and we should kind of like gather from all of these perspectives, and they're all kind of equally weighted. But I was also just looking back to what you have here on the slide, that who in the absence of the king of the jinn is there to say that their judgments made from such perspectives are worse than ours. So there's this dependency on some kind of like king or God to make this kind of value judgment. And I'm having sort of trouble reconciling the two ideas, what you mentioned at the end and what you're mentioning here. And I was wondering if you could clarify that.
So D is supposed to be the indecidability claim. So animals somehow think one thing. We don't maybe know what it is, but they must think something other than what we think. And now how do we resolve that disagreement, right? And in both the Zhuangzi and in Sextus, we had the point, well, there's no third party. Actually, the Zhuangzi even says even if there were a third party, that third party would have its own axe to grind, so that still wouldn't help, right? So given that there's no third party to judge, and I'm sort of saying, well, like you could imagine a situation where we invent this third party, right, the king of the jinn, but in fact we don't have the king of the jinn handy, right? So we only have animals and humans to deal with, and so that's why it remains undecidable. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay,
I
does that answer the question?
My
though?
question is,
Maybe I'm not
at the very
understanding
end you
question.
say, well, if there is a king, but then you sort of end with, but there's still, like they're all kind of equally weighted anyway. I guess I'm having trouble understanding.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So the king of the jinn, the peng bird, or the Daoist sage, or God, probably could resolve the difference, right? So God could say, I can tell you that the fish are correct, right? Because God knows everything. But the point in these different texts will be that we don't have, it will be that normally humans don't have access to that kind of deciding perspective. So there are, such perspectives are considered, right? So the Jain sage, the Ford maker, he knows not just, and I think is always a he in Jainism, he knows not just how that you need to have this kind of multi-perspectival take on the world, but he even knows what's correct and what's wrong about each of the individual one-sided perspectives, right? So it's not like they're ruling out the possibility of such a decisive perspective in principle. They're just saying that we almost never have access to it. And that's why it's skeptical, right? So it's skeptical in a way that Sextus wouldn't be happy with. So Sextus thinks you'll always get into irresolvability and you'll always have to suspend judgment. So skepticism is his final position. I'm suggesting that skepticism in the Zhuangzi is just a step along the path to the true Taoist position, which is no longer skeptical, but the perspective of the peng bird. Right. Okay. Johanna.
I still want to ask you, I think it's very important, what your favorite animal is and why.
Well, I'm so glad you asked. So my favorite animal is, of course, the giraffe. And the reason why is actually that when I was so back to teleology, in fact. So I was writing a podcast a long time ago, and I just wanted an example to illustrate teleology, so the idea that things are goal-directed or purposive. And I was like, oh, the neck of the giraffe allows it to eat things off tall trees. And so having used this example, I then thought it would be funny to keep using it, and things got out of hand. So I think this is how often enthusiasms start, sort of randomly, and then, yeah. But yes, the giraffe. I think you knew the answer to that question. Okay, yeah?
Thank you. I apologize for missing yesterday and coming late today. So if you've covered this, let me know. But I'm interested in method, and I'm interested in philosophy of history. And maybe that's the same question. Just by way of background, I'm a media historian, and it's common for historians to make analogies.
Media.
Media.
Okay, I thought
So, for
I said
example,
medieval. But,
No,
okay.
media, to compare the printing press to the computer.
Gotcha. Okay.
For example. And some of my historian friends don't like that polygamy of archive. I mean, they think it's sort of strange to be jumping across periods. And the thing that impresses me about you is the sort of ease or facility with which you can imagine a dialogue among the dead.
Yeah.
Zhuangzi, Aristotle, Montaigne. And just when I think of Hegel, I mean, philosophy is always embedded in its time. And so it's very difficult to sort of imagine extracting a bundle of arguments out of its particular historical development. And it just helped me understand how you're able to move so freely. I mean, do you have to posit a kind of common human nature or a common set of problematics that underlie this? I mean, how do you think about your method, which is very impressive? I don't mean this critically. I'm just genuinely interested in how you pull it off.
Thanks. So actually, James did ask me a similar question about this, but I think there's more to say about it in light of what I just said in today's lecture. So, I mean, thank you for saying that I seem to be doing it well, but actually you might even, if one wanted to be more critical, you might say, well, actually, the more effortless this looks, the worse it is, because there should be a huge amount of friction, and it shouldn't be so easy to just pop from Montaigne to Sextus to the Zhuangzi, right? Because surely their concerns are vastly different and blah, 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 right? And I think that, so I actually have a lot of sympathy for that. And as I said yesterday, I'm usually someone who likes to sort of stick with one tradition at a time. So the challenge I'm taking on in this project is to do this kind of moving back and forth thing, which may or may not be comparative, in a way that doesn't falsify the material. So what I said yesterday was that you can set the stage by posing a kind of abstract philosophical question, which is sufficiently fundamental that you could sort of hope that lots of philosophers would have interesting things to say about it. So I think this issue about the differences between humans and animals is so clearly there that philosophers will come upon it and start thinking about it. And similarly with the problems of the other two lectures. So the problem of the first lecture is why are we made without knowing everything? The problem of the second lecture is how should we deal with the fact that rituals often don't work? And since rituals exist in every society, someone did actually ask me whether it's fair to use the word ritual for all these different traditions, but actually I think that one can defend. And so as soon as you set up and this is a very philosopher's way of thinking, right? Here's a problem. Tell me what you think, world, right? That's kind of what I'm doing. I think something that comes out of this lecture, and I've toyed with the idea of saying this at the end of the book, is that this perspective, this idea of having a kind of multivocity of many perspectives, is in a way instantiated by the project, right?
You're a Jainist.
Kind of, yeah. So the fact that the Jains and Daoists win here in the end, that they have the best answer to the skeptical challenge, I think the fact that I resonate with that is probably not a coincidence, given that it's such a good match to what I'm doing, right? So I'm kind of trying to, hopefully I'm giving each tradition and each text even its due, and trying to think about what are they trying to do here in their text, what are their concerns, and it's not always the same, while also thinking, well, they do contribute something to this one problem, and so you're kind of seeing the problem from at least many different points of view. So that's what I'm trying to do, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Another really fascinating lecture. So I'll bite on the comparison with religious pluralism and invite you to say a bit more about that. As a jumping off point, one thing that strikes me is that what we might call in sort of mainstream analytic philosophy as sort of standard Hick-style pluralism often seems to really want to overcome the inconceivability problem, and to be able to identify as part of the argument for the view some of the specific contributions that different sorts of seeming religious disagreement might make to the sort of overall picture. But I took you to be saying that actually more fruitful approaches in general might be to embrace the inconceivability problem, as in A here with what you're identifying with the Ikhwan. So would love to hear about, in some of these comparisons with religious pluralism and what you think might be promising there, are you proposing trying to adopt the inconceivability problem as something to really take seriously, or maybe to overcome, or is this framing it not in a helpful sort of way?
Yeah, so actually, one of the other chapters I'd like to write for the book is basically about, it's a skeptical problem that comes up very clearly, for example, in the Muslim theologian Ghazali. So he says, okay, here I am, I'm a Muslim, but then I must reflect on the fact that I was born into a Muslim environment. I was raised by Muslim parents, and that's why I'm a Muslim.
Yeah.
That's not why I want to be a Muslim. I want to be a Muslim because Islam is true, right? And then what he does is to say, well, therefore I must, and I wrote a book about this, another book, I must reject what they call taqlid, which is uncritical acceptance of a tradition or authority. So I just go with whatever I've been taught. He says, no, that can't be good enough. I must sort of go back to the principles and judge for myself whether Muhammad is a genuine prophet. And so I immersed myself in tales of the prophet and all the evidence we have about him and satisfied myself that indeed he is a genuine prophet and that the Christians and Jews and so on are wrong to reject his prophecy, right? So that's one way you could take. And since I already talked about that elsewhere, what I wanted to look at here, and also because it's maybe a more skeptical or provisional attitude, we talked about this at lunch actually, is thinkers who say, well, who knows who's right, at least for now. I will just follow the tradition in which I find myself. So we find, for example, Cicero, Sextus, Montaigne again, and Descartes saying this. So Descartes, in what he calls his provisional morality, in the Discourse on the Method, says, my first rule, until I figure out for sure what's going on, is to just follow the religious customs of my culture, right? So I think that is a kind of relatively skeptical solution to the problem of religious diversity. So you're kind of admitting that in principle other religions may be either on a par or even correct, while yours are not. But but you shouldn't immediately lose all your religious commitments simply because you've noticed that there are other religions, because you got to start from somewhere. Or maybe I think also for some of these authors, just not being religious at all wasn't even a possibility, right? So maybe for them the problem of religious diversity is different than it is for us today.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps this is a semantic point to some extent, but it sounds like some of what you're describing might be suspension of judgment and then a principle of action, after you've suspended judgment, rather than something like pluralism, where you're actually committing to something like the truth of different traditions. Right.
So I think these, what you'd find difficult to locate in pre-modern philosophy is genuine religious pluralism. So, I mean, I'd love to get examples if anyone knows of any, but I think what we get instead is something more like an acknowledgement of the fact of plural religions and then non-pluralist responses to that fact. One, the Ghazalian move, being to defend one's own perspective, and the other being to say, well, yeah, I kind of can see there's an issue here, but I'm going to go with my tradition for now, and maybe I will be able to establish it later on, maybe not. But we'll see, right? And actually, I don't think Descartes there's people in this room who know more about Descartes than I do, for sure. But I don't think Descartes really ever got beyond that. I mean, it's not like he ever showed up and said, here's my proof that Catholicism is true. He does talk about the Eucharist, actually, which is an unwise move, to put it mildly. But he's not someone he's not like Raymond Sebon, who comes along and says, here's my arguments for Christianity. That's not his project, obviously. So I think he probably never got beyond the provisional stance. Okay, yeah, James?
Thanks again for another very intriguing lecture. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude that as someone who wants to do global philosophy myself, you've given me a great model
Thanks.
for what to aspire to in my own research. as a specialist in ancient Chinese philosophy, I'd also like to say as well that we're all siloed in our research domain, so I appreciate that you've been able to expand my perspective and introduce me to like Thomas Nagel and his obsession with bats.
Yeah.
I joke, of course. But I would like to, in my question, return to the Nagel before Nagel, Zhuangzi's argument about the happy fish.
Mm-hmm.
Could you pull up the text, please? I'm curious about the status of Huizi's final move in the dialogue. He seems to be drawing a conclusion that he's entitled to draw, but which he cannot know.
Yeah.
And that seems to prompt Zhuangzi to want to reset the whole slate of their discourse. And I was wondering what you think about that conclusion. Is it still valid for Huizi to draw that the conclusion that it's complete that Zhuangzi doesn't know that fish are happy?
Right, yeah. So that actually, I agree with you that, people often find the last part deeply mysterious, but I think I actually understand, well, I have a story about it, which I gave at the end. Mm-hmm. I find that sentence, but you'll grant that you're not a fish, or actually that whole remark from Huizi, will grant that not being you, I don't know about you, but you'll grant that you're not a fish, and that completes the case that you don't know the fish are happy. So I think what Huizi is the simplest, most straightforward interpretation would be, well, yes, I can see that the principle, my perspective principle, applies to you and me, right? But unless you challenge my principle, the principle also applies to you and the fish, right? So you've tried to turn the tables on me, right? And I agree you can turn the tables on me, but it's not enough for you to tell me that I don't know how things are for you. You actually have to critique the principle. So do that, my friend. Because he says, you'll grant, if I knew Chinese as you do, we could you could just look at the text and tell us what it really says. But assuming this is a good translation, you'll grant, or maybe you ought to grant, that you're not a fish and therefore you don't know the fish are happy. That looks like he's just inviting him to apply the principle consistently, right? So if Zhuangzi's move is just a kind of ad hominem response, right, your own principle undermines your argument, he says, no, it's not just, you can't get me that way, because the principle, if it applies to you and me, would also apply to you and the fish, right? So that's kind of how I understand it.
So to follow up, do you think that the one thing you drew out in your analysis of this passage was that it's kind of curious why Zhuangzi says, you asked me already knowing that I knew. Yeah. Do you think that's where the challenge to the principle lies?
Yeah, or even, maybe it even is from, I knew it from up above the how. So what I was suggesting is he was saying, you're standing next to me, right? So don't you also think the fish are happy, right? And that's kind of that point that the two of them are looking at it from the same place is supposed to explain why he knows that Huizi already knows that Zhuangzi knows that the fish are happy.
So it's not a sophism, but rather Zhuangzi is making the move that you have the very same grounds for knowing that I do.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Or
maybe being a Daoist, he's saying, don't you have the very same grounds for knowing that I do? You tell me, right? So he's sort of offering, it's like an offer to share his perspective, which I think is quite beautiful, actually, and very typical of the Zhuangzi, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you've never read a work of Chinese philosophy, by the way, you would be tempted to read the Analects, probably, which is a great choice, but read the Zhuangzi. It's amazing. Okay, do we have time for any more questions?
Sure.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, Jonathan?
Thanks. I think I heard a version of this in Aberdeen a couple of years ago, but
Sorry.
I don't know if you... Sorry, great again the second time. But there was something that I was thinking about throughout that you only really mentioned, I think, properly at the end, which was the question of imagination.
Yeah.
So I guess in the Nagel case, you know, you can try and imagine what it's like to be a bat, and his whole point is you can't. Or maybe even in this case here, you know, Zhuangzi thinks that he can imagine what it's like to be one of the fishes, and Huizi says, no, you can't really imagine, or that imagination's not really epistemically useful here in terms of knowing what it is like to be. But then at the end, you mentioned something about the Daoists putting giving some significance to the idea of imagination.
Yeah.
But I couldn't tell if it was in like an ethical context that sort of, you
Right.
know, we can't know, but if we have to know how to treat them in the absence of knowing, then
Yeah.
try and imagine, or something like that.
Mhm.
So that would be the small sort of clarificatory question, and then the larger one would just be whether any of the traditions that you've discussed here do have a slightly larger epistemic role for imagination and what it might
Right.
do.
Yeah. Actually, you're right that I've been working on this paper for a while, and so you heard an early version of it. And in that version, I had this kind of final line, which was Nagel would say, I can't know what it's like to be a bat. Zhuangzi would say, try harder. And then I think maybe even in Aberdeen, someone said, well, Daoists aren't really into trying. They're more into not trying, right? So that seems like a strange note to end on, a rather un-Daoist note to end on. And I was like, yeah, that's right. And so I wrote this new ending, also partially to connect it to the themes of the other lectures and bring in the Jane comparison. So so actually the line you're pointing, so what I said is, Zhuangzi would presumably tell Nagel that his inability to do so is a failure of philosophical imagination. So that's my words. It's not, and so I'm not really latching on to an invocation of imagination in the Zhuangzi necessarily, but now that you're asking, I think it's actually a really interesting thought that the way that we access other people's perspectives and also maybe other animals' perspectives is not through something like reason or indeed science, right? So you might think, well, how do I know what other animals are experiencing? Well, I should do a lot of cognitive science and zoology and so on. And that doesn't sound wrong. But on the other hand, maybe I should find a poem by a really good poet who's written about what it's like to be a fish, right? And would it be overly optimistic to think that that will tell me the answer? Perhaps, but I think it could be illuminating, right? And so what is the poet doing? The poet might be sort of exploiting their imagination, their ability to enter into other people's perspectives. And I think actually maybe it did come up when we were talking about, or when I was talking about Montaigne, because I think, so people always talk about Montaigne and Shakespeare, right? Because they live almost exactly at the same time. Shakespeare read Montaigne, and they're kind of these two figures on the cusp of modernity, right? It's almost like, here's what could have happened if Luther hadn't come along 2 decades later and ruined everything, right? We could have had lots of Shakespeare and Montaigne, right? And I think, so something people always say about Shakespeare, like his apparently miraculous ability to enter into the characters somehow, including people vastly, vastly different from him, different gender, different, you name it. That's something that's true of Montaigne as well. And in fact, it's maybe one of the most appealing things about Montaigne. And I would call that an act of the imagination, right? I can't, off the top of my head, I can't tell you whether imagination is a word he uses a lot, but I wouldn't be surprised. So, so I think actually that would really be worth exploring further, the idea that imagination is the power by which we overcome these supposed barriers that prevent us from identifying with other points of view. So I think that's a very fruitful idea.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think my question follows up actually on Max's. So I got interested, as Max was talking, in the difference between the case of human-animal pluralism and the case of human-human pluralism.
Right, yeah.
And like how well the analogy actually works.
Right, because they keep sliding across it, right?
Yeah. I mean, it seems like you would have a version of the problem you were talking about in the case of human-human pluralism as well. It's a little more unsavory to talk about it, right? But like, it's actually been hard for lots of people in human history to imagine that there are lots of different ways human beings might think about things that are equally legitimate.
Yep.
And in a way, that's almost easier in the case of animals because they live such very different lives. It would be weird if they had the same cognitive strategies that human beings have. whereas with other human beings, maybe you just want to think some cognitive strategies are intrinsically inferior to others. And so I guess it was very clear in your Greek example that the human-human and the human-animal case are kind of working together. But like, do you think that these thinkers are thinking differently about the analogy between the human-human case and the human-animal case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and actually, it's very tempting to say that in these texts, the animal-human case is just, as it were, a stalking horse for the human-human case, right? That's what they really care about. And in fact, I almost made that move at the end when I said, well, this is a lot like the issue of religious pluralism, right? And I think that's not wrong. So in particular, Sextus introduces the first mode just as an introduction to a whole bunch of other modes where the target is clearly getting you to suspend judgment about disagreements between humans. He doesn't really care about what's going on with the animals. What he wants is to suspend judgment. I mean, some people think that actually Sextus is only targeting philosophical beliefs and not beliefs tout court. I actually am more on the latter view, but certainly he's thinking mostly about human-human disagreement. I think of the texts, though, I mean, the three main texts that I used were the Zhuangzi, the Sextus, and the Ikhwan. And I actually think that both Zhuangzi and the Ikhwan really are taking the animal thing very seriously. So if, like, you could certainly say that in both cases the implicit target might be human-human disagreement, but the Ikhwan's entire treatise is about animals, and the fact that Zhuangzi keeps coming back over and over to animals, and also the fact that Taoism is very much about like humans sort of understanding their place in nature and so on. Similarly, the Ikhwan are very interested in the idea that humans should understand their place in God's creation, and that God cares about animals just as much as, maybe even as much as he cares about us, but certainly he cares about them. I think these are things pushing them towards taking the animal-human case quite seriously. It's not just a kind of stand-in for the human case, which is what they really care about.
Thanks for another fascinating lecture. I'm still worried about premise C in that skeptical
me too.
argument. First of all, it seems like a dogmatic claim, and I'm not sure what place it has in a skeptical argument.
Right.
And secondly, it actually seems quite difficult to establish. I mean, one could have different accounts of what the conditions are for attributing a tacit judgment.
I'm not finding it.
But from my rather Kantian point of view, the very least would be that one is vulnerable to criticism and receptive to criticism, including self-criticism.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how you would establish that these unknowable animals, following the first premise,
absolutely. Right.
are engaging in criticism and self-criticism.
Yeah, right.
It may be that they don't need to have language to do that, but I just don't know how you would establish it, which,
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And in fact, I think that's why Sextus and Montaigne do the thing I was objecting to, which is this anthropocentric thing of saying, well, look at the amazing things they do, right? How could they be doing this without making judgments which aren't on a par with ours? Because that's the most tempting path here towards answering your objection. Like, how do I know that they're making judgments? Especially since, as I said, Aristotle and the Stoics, and maybe Plato, but who knows with Plato?
Yeah.
As so often, if not always, who knows with Plato? But the Stoics and Plato and Aristotle for sure would say, "What are you talking about? Animals don't make judgments." I mean, in fact, the whole Stoic theory of assent sort of turns on the idea that animals don't do that. Right? That's the difference between them and us. That's what makes us rational and them non-rational. So, it's not only a dogmatic claim, as you said; it's also a highly contentious dogmatic claim. Right, so it's not one that the skeptics can easily make. So I think they don't. That's why they don't draw attention to it, right? They don't. They kind of are slipping it in because they need it to get the animals to be disagreeing with us. Because how could they disagree with us if they aren't even forming propositional attitudes, right? So I think you're right that that's the weakest part of the argument, the sort of revised version of the argument that let me see if I can find it. There we go. So C, right? So why think they're making tacit judgments? And I mean, I guess if I were going to defend it, I would say something like this. Well, animal behavior is inexplicable without supposing that they're making tacit judgments. But I don't need to say that their judgments are a lot like ours in light of A. I just need to say that so when the donkey sort of turns its nose up at the gold, it's judging that it's worthless, at least tacitly, right?
Is it Chrysippus, if I remember correctly, who thinks
dog.
that dogs engage in disjunctive syllogism?
Yeah, so this is the so-called dialectical dog.
Right.
I kind of feel like it's ridiculous explaining this with Brad in the room, but so the idea is there's a dog pursuing a prey, and it comes to a three-way fork, A, B, C, three roads, A, B, and C, and it sniffs down road A, doesn't smell the prey, sniffs down road B, doesn't smell the prey, and then without sniffing, runs down road C. So it's obviously had formed the syllogism either A or B or C, not A, not B, therefore C, the dialectical dog. And there are other examples too. The Stoics say that the animals are engaging in what they call quasi-reasoning, which I find not even quasi-convincing. Yeah.
Please come join us for the reception and just thank you.